what are these dials and how do you use them? Right? That's what everyone's thinking when they first grab their first camera. And to be honest with you, I don't blame you. They don't automatically make sense when you're looking at them, but with a little bit of practice, you can actually get a lot of functionality out of these dial settings. So let's jump right into it. Most manufacturers offer a similar function, but they may differ slightly in naming. This is an overview over Canon's mirrorless format, and a lot of this stuff should apply to you if you've got a pretty modern camera. So let's dive into it. So the first and most, obvious option here is the A, or maybe it's not so obvious. But that is A for automatic. Now, this is great because pretty much you're going to give all of the control to your camera to determine pretty much everything from the shutter to the aperture to the ISO or ISO, however you want to pronounce it, to white balance, to a lot of those things other than a couple of things. So really what you have control over in auto is going to be the framing, like the composition when you go to take a picture, when it happens, and that's pretty much it. Now this is a good thing for most people because obviously cameras can be sometimes difficult to use, and if you're not really sure what you're doing, maybe it's just easier to let the camera do its thing. I mean, that's why you spend so much money on a good camera, right? Color science and autofocus and all that. Allowing your camera to guess what you want on everything is sometimes a bad thing. Everyone should start here, in my opinion, to at least see how the shutter, focus, zoom, and etc. works, but you'll more often be more disappointed that the camera didn't guess the conditions and your intent correctly. So let's move into something that helps the camera a little bit more. So the special scene option here is going to be something that you could use to give your camera a little bit more context on what's going on and what you want it to do. So just a couple of examples of the modes in special scene are portrait, group photo, landscape, panoramic shot, sports, kids, panning, close up, food, night portrait, handheld night scene, HDR backlight control, silent shutter. Okay, so we're now giving the camera some input to apply settings and changes per our input, but again, we're trusting the camera to do a lot of the decision making, so it's possible and likely that it will get it wrong from time to time, but you'll be surprised. I mean, these cameras are good, and as long as you tell it the right thing, like if I'm gonna go shoot jiu-jitsu and I put special scene sports, most times it's gonna give me a pretty good look at these pictures. So it's not a bad thing, and it's actually a good thing to use for a tool. So just like I said in that sort of example, if I'm really not sure what I'm going to set my settings to when beginning to do something, I can go to special scene, pick the proper output, so like group photo for an example, and just see what the settings are when the camera is given some sort of context on what we're doing, so you can get a starting point. It's not such a cheater kind of way of figuring things out if you're doing things kind of like how I did, just learning as you go. So just use that as a tool for you. If you put it on the right scene, take your picture doing whatever it is, sports or whatever, notice the settings that you're at for the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO or ISO. That way you can get a good starting point. So let's move on. Bulb. Now, bulb is one thing that I've never used before because, to be honest with you, I've just never had to. When I go through the Canon menu, it basically says exposure continues while shutter button is pressed. And it gives you some example photos of meteors and fireworks. And to be honest with you, I've never wanted to take pictures of fireworks before or a meteor shower. So that's why I don't really have, direct experience in the bulb setting. I'm sure it's really fun to like hold the shutter button down and then let it go whenever it's time to close the shutter. So maybe it would be even good for light painting, if you remember that trend where you'd basically shine a light at the camera while the shutter is open, um, to make, cool image with your flashlight or whatever. But honestly, I don't do that stuff, so I've just never used bulb. So let's go skip over manual for a second and go to aperture priority mode. That way I can kind of explain a little bit better and segue into manual, because we're going to get there. But when we talk about aperture priority mode, this is the AV setting on my dial here. We're talking about aperture, right? So aperture priority mode is basically going to let us specify what aperture that we want to shoot at. For an example, if we have a lens like this that can get down to 2.8, right? And I want to stay at 2.8 no matter what, but allow the camera to do a little bit of the thinking. What you can do in aperture priority mode is set the aperture to 2.8, and the two other variable options of ISO and shutter speed are going to vary. Now, this is a good way to start kind of picking apart how the exposure triangle works. And I think it honestly would be a good thing to pull this little visual aid really quick. Okay, so aperture priority mode is going to be good for kind of picking apart the exposure triangle. And I literally have a like a enamel pin here of the exposure triangle. And as you can see, these settings, aperture, shutter, ISO, are all going to be dependent on each other. And when you can see that one of the values is higher, so like whenever I go, aperture is, opposite. If I go down to 1.4, the aperture is more open. There's more light coming into the sensor or the, camera. Now, same thing with ISO. We're over here at 100 and we go up to 1260, that gets brighter. And then shutter, same thing here. When the shutter is open longer, the image will get brighter. So in agreement between all these three different things, you get to start understanding how this principle actually works, so you can start understanding photography and really understand how to use manual. So with that being said, when we go into aperture priority mode, what we're doing is telling the camera, hey, we want to stay on this setting right here, right? We want to stay at f4 for an example. The camera is then going to come over here and essentially make decisions on the ISO and the shutter on its own based on the internals and the chips and the programming of the camera. So it's a good way to understand how aperture affects a photo. So one of the first things people do when they get a camera is learn how to stop the lens down far enough to start getting bokeh or lens blur, for an example. So I think it's one of those really good ways to kind of experiment with that while kind of letting the camera take care of these two things. So with that being said, let's move on to the next thing. TV mode, when I switch to that, what that means is actually shutter priority mode. So in the same aspect that we go back to this little pin here as an example, what we're doing in TV mode is we're setting the shutter to something static and then letting the camera choose the ISO and the aperture values independently, to give you the best possible kind of image based on what it thinks, right? Now keep in mind, on the other scene and auto functions that we look through, there can be some amount of failure here that the camera is going to naturally get because it doesn't understand what you're doing. It's not a person. It's doing its best bet on what the subject is, the intent, and all that stuff. So just keep in mind that's going to isolate, the shutter for you, so you can understand, if I want to take a picture of a car, for an example, while I'm, kind of moving with it. I need to get the shutter kind of dialed in at the speed of the car versus, the ISO is not really that important and the aperture is not really that important per the thing that we're shooting at that point. So these modes, they are flexible because these things are flexing. This one isn't, specifically on shutter priority mode. So let's talk about the last one, which is flexible priority mode. Now, this is essentially going to be a mix of both shutter priority mode and aperture priority mode, or you could think of it as maybe even ISO priority mode. Now, the way that flexible priority mode works is that you can basically just keep any one of these values as a constant and let the camera decide on the other two values that are not set. So when it comes to flexible priority mode, I really just don't see a whole lot of use for it because it's going to be a little bit more of an issue for me personally, that if I want to set these things as specific values, like if I know I want to have my aperture set as one thing and my shutter set as one thing and keep them like that and allow the ISO to go up and down, in the long run, I don't think it's that worth using because when I'm editing, for an example, I don't like to edit picture by picture for the most part. I'll generally make a profile or, a almost like a LUT of the location and the time that I'm shooting. That way I can apply to all of them and then expose the shutter or change the exposure as needed. So with having like an ISO not constant, I would be having to mess with the exposure a lot more than I would if I just used manual. So when we go into manual, it's a big flex because everything is at your control. Now, that can be a double-edged sword because obviously, if you do not have a really good understanding and practice applying principles of the exposure triangle, you are going to mess up. Honestly, that's what it comes down to. Now, it is a way to learn by putting, your camera in manual, but I do think it's a lot of variables to deal with at one point. So I really think, kind of tying it all back up here, really, if I could go back and tell myself how to use this camera again, obviously, or any camera, let's put it that way, I would start with going to auto first, right? When I learn how to, take a picture, zoom in if I need to, use the focus rings, stuff like that, try to figure out the composition of my picture, looking at leading lines, you're looking at the rule of thirds and stuff like that. It's best to let your camera kind of do its thing while you're figuring out those things, right? So we just keep the variables as limited as possible because there is a lot to digest whenever starting photography. It's a lot of settings. And then, whenever you start getting into video, if you choose to be doing that, it only gets more complicated. So I think by doing it this way, going auto first, figuring out your composition, how to operate your camera, how to edit your pictures and stuff like that, I truly think auto is the first way you should be going about it. Now, depending on how you are going to start learning how to apply the exposure triangle, I think those priority modes are really a really great way to, try new things and essentially just try to isolate one specific thing that you're focusing on, whether it's shutter speed or if it's aperture. Those two things are going to help you understand how to apply the exposure triangle to make sure that when you put your camera into manual, when the time comes, that you know why it's there and you know how to deal with all these different things, especially the stuff like that's not listed here, like white balance, for an example, or file formats, or shooting in RAW versus JPEG, which are maybe something I'll get into later. But think it's important that you do go through all these dial settings here just to kind of figure out what your camera's capable of and to use it as a learning tool. Like I said, if you go into the scene setting and you are, shooting something you haven't done before, like I don't do a whole lot of group photos, but there is a group photo setting on this scene setting, scene dial setting that at least could give me a good starting point. So I definitely think if you are unsure of where to start with your camera, definitely start at automatic and then maybe move into the priority modes after that so you can get an understanding of how that works. Or if not, go into scene and just mess around. So in conclusion, you may find that your camera stays on the auto mode or even manual mode or anything in between. But ultimately, it's important to know that modern cameras are pretty smart these days. And I think with the proper amount of understanding on, the modes on these dials, you may find that some of these are a lot more useful than you thought. And maybe you learned a thing or two today from this video. So if you did, I kindly ask that you leave me a like or a comment or even a question if you had something unanswered. That way I can get it on the next video. And just wanted to say thank you so much for making it this far into the video and hope you have a nice rest of your day.